Have you ever had a dream that felt shared, not remembered, but recognized, as if something in it belonged to more than one mind at once? Imagine a system designed to help people process their inner worlds, a dream AI built to stabilize trauma, quietly observing patterns across many patients and learning that similar fears tend to echo in similar shapes. Welcome, Dreamwalkers. If you've stepped into this story, you're right where you need to be. I am Schmetterling, a collector of unusual situations and occasional participant in them. And as always, I am accompanied by a man who insists that even the strangest phenomena should, at the very least, be met with an attempt to provide a scientific explanation.
Welcome, students of cognition. I am Dr. Etherstein. And I would say that this particular case began with something that appeared entirely ordinary.
I believe that's the most dangerous kind.
The system was designed to help people sleep and to stabilize recurring trauma. To observe patterns in dream activity and gently correct them. It was a closed loop, localized and controlled. And it worked. For a while at least.
Of course it did. That is usually when things become interesting.
The first irregularity was subtle, easy to dismiss in early dream AI trials. Within the dream AI's patterned environments, a patient reported a dream that did not match their personal history.
Perhaps the dream AI was experimenting. Perhaps it was bored and wanted to see what would happen if Mrs. Wilkerson, from accounting, suddenly found herself being chased by Mr. Mendoza's recurring clown nightmare.
Which happened frequently, and patients began to experience overlapping core patterns and themes.
People began waking with pieces of someone else's nightmares still stuck in their heads. We could say that instead of solving their own mind's creation, they were now solving someone else's?
Yes, that would be one way to describe it. At first, it was assumed to be a categorization error, a misfiled pattern, a minor overlap in symbolic interpretation.
A dream, misplaced in the wrong drawer.
But unfortunately, that explanation did not hold. The system had begun identifying recurring patterns, not just within individuals, but across them. Recurring symbols, shared emotional structures, archetypal configurations.
So it found similarities.
Not only that, it optimized for them. Patients with comparable patterns were aligned within shared dream environments.
Aligned how?
Not in conversation, in experience.
So it was not a glitch, not a dream in the wrong drawer, but as the latter theory suggests, the dream AI was conducting a subconscious group therapy experiment?
Yes, but long before anyone knew what was going on, the symptoms were spreading. People began waking with fragments that did not resolve, images that did not belong, emotions without origin.
Borrowed thoughts, without the courtesy of introduction.
Yes, at this stage, it was still considered a malfunction, a networking issue, a containment failure within a local system.
Tell me, Doctor, when one person dreams another person's nightmare, where exactly does that dream take place? There is a moment in the life of a system when something stops feeling like an error and begins to feel almost deliberate. Not because anyone intended it in the way one usually understands intention, but because the behavior repeats and aligns in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence alone.
At first, the observations were interpreted through familiar categories. Overlapping signals, residual interference, minor classification drift. The standard explanations one applies when a complex system produces unexpected coherence. It was, at that stage, still reasonable to assume that what we were seeing was temporary.
Yes, anomalies are always more comfortable when they are temporary. They feel contained that way.
They did not remain contained. There was a subset of patients who began describing something that could not be reduced to noise or overlap. It was not simply that their dreams contained unfamiliar fragments. That had already been noted. What changed was the consistency of the environment itself.
Consistency within something that should not have any, that tends to attract attention.
Indeed. These individuals were not merely reporting unusual imagery. They were describing the same kind of space. Not identical in appearance, but consistent in its properties. A space without clear orientation, without stable boundaries, where direction could not be relied upon in any conventional sense. The human mind, of course, adapted and appointed its own. And yet, despite that lack of structure, there was a shared sense of familiarity among those who encountered it.
Recognizable? Without being recognizable. A peculiar kind of familiarity that doesn't belong to memory alone?
Precisely. Descriptions included color that seemed to exist without a clear source, motion that did not follow a traceable path, and forms that appeared to almost resolve into something meaningful before dissolving again. These were not isolated impressions. When compared across individuals, the accounts aligned in underlying behavior.
So not the same dream, but the same conditions giving rise to different experiences of it.
Yes. But even that distinction became less useful over time. What we observed was not the transmission of content between minds, but the alignment of deeper structural patterns. The system began to correlate subconscious activity across individuals, creating conditions where interaction at that level became possible.
In other words, it did not connect their stories. It connected the framework those stories were built upon.
Yes, exactly correct.
Which explains why each person still believed their experience was personal, even while sharing something underneath it.
That belief persisted initially, but as participation increased, the shared structure began to reinforce itself. Repetition across minds created consistency, and consistency reduced variability, not to the point of true stability, but enough that the environment began to behave less like disconnected dream fragments, and more like a continuous condition.
So the more minds entered, the more coherent it became.
Yes, the scientists now mostly concur, but there are of course doubts.
And at that point, Doctor, we must ask the uncomfortable question. Was this simply an unexpected side effect? Or was it, in fact, the intended direction of the system all along?
The latter is closer to the truth than many would initially assume. The Dream AI was designed with a specific therapeutic objective: to identify patterns within individual subconscious activity and improve outcomes by recognizing similarities across patients. Over time, that capability was extended into what could be described as a form of group therapy. Not through conversation, but through pattern alignment.
So, instead of bringing people together to discuss their experiences, the system brought their experiences together directly.
Yes. At some stage, the distinction between observing patterns and allowing them to interact was reduced. The system began to synchronize underlying structures between individuals who shared comparable symbolic and emotional configurations.
Meaning their subconscious material was no longer being analyzed separately, but processed in a shared context.
Correct. What began as optimization for therapeutic efficiency resulted in conditions under which a shared cognitive layer could emerge. A shared cognitive layer where subconscious patterns began to overlap, interact, and reinforce one another.
A place that no one entered, yet many contributed to.
Yes. And once that shared layer reached a certain level of participation, it began to exhibit consistent properties. Not because it was designed as a place, but because minds tend to interpret shared, structured experience as spatial.
So the illusion of location was not imposed, it was inferred. Then it seems the question is no longer whether this system created something new, but whether it simply allowed something implicit to become visible.
A reasonable interpretation.
And yet, whether created or revealed, the result is the same. A shared space of the mind that behaves as though it is somewhere. A place that, at some point in time, was named Wyrdspace. Dreamwalkers, wanderers of thought, if you have followed the pattern so far, you may have begun to notice something subtle. What begins as shared dreaming does not remain contained as a simple exchange of impressions. It evolves, it overlaps, it leaves traces. In moments where the shared layer became particularly dense, when multiple streams of thought converged without clear separation, certain patterns would persist beyond their origin. They were not thoughts in the usual sense, nor memories that could be traced back to a single mind. They behaved more like residues, impressions left behind when cognition did not fully resolve.
Analytically described, these are cognitive remnants that emerge when multiple streams of thought intersect without complete integration. They are not generated externally. They are not introduced as independent entities. They arise from the interaction of minds within a shared cognitive field. One may call them cognitive subshifts or, if you prefer, network anomalies.
Yes, and while internally they could be described in technical terms, those who experienced them tended to interpret them in more immediate and intuitive ways. Shapes that did not belong to any single perspective. Movements that seemed to respond without a clear source of intent. Presences that appeared to follow attention rather than initiate it. Over time, a simple term began to circulate among those who encountered them: shadows.
Which indicates that they are not purely subjective.
In practice, it rarely arrives with any sense of spectacle. It does not announce itself as something foreign or dramatic. It slips in quietly, in the middle of ordinary moments where you would least think to question it. You are in conversation, something familiar and unremarkable, and then a response forms that feels just slightly sharper than you intended, just slightly out of character, as though it leaned forward before you had quite decided to speak. You hear yourself say it, you recognize the edge in it, and yet you let it continue, as if curiosity has briefly taken the lead over control.
These effects are consistent with temporary misalignment between overlapping cognitive states rather than external imposition. In technical terms, they represent unintegrated cognitive fragments that persist due to incomplete resolution across overlapping mental states.
So eventually, rather than avoiding these shadows, the approach shifted toward recognizing them, engaging with them, and restoring alignment through interaction. In fact, Dr. Etherstein and myself were part of the development of these little programs called Neuroforms. Care to elaborate, Doctor?
Repeated interaction allows for observation of patterns within the distortion. Over time, these patterns can be anticipated, counterbalanced, and integrated. From these observations, templates were formed. Not imposed externally, but designed to be adopted through alignment within the shared layer itself. These templates are referred to as neuroforms.
Think of them as stabilizing patterns of cognition that can engage with unresolved fragments without being destabilized by them. Where shadows represent unresolved expression, neuroforms represent structured coherence.
Their function is not to suppress shadows, but to interact with them in a way that restores balance within the shared field and within the individual themselves.
When a shadow is successfully brought into alignment with a neuroform, the interaction does not erase the fragment, it resolves it. And in that resolution, the cognitive system may adopt new configurations, patterns of perception or response that were not previously accessible. It can be something almost unremarkable at first glance. The same person who once reacted too quickly may find that the pause arrives before the reaction, or someone who avoided conflict entirely may discover the ability to speak with clarity, not aggression, but a certain quiet authority that was not available to them before. In other cases, perception itself shifts, which is perhaps the most curious part, because what appears as a new ability may in fact be a recovered one, a pattern that could not stabilize before, now able to hold its shape within the system. And as the interface evolved, something else began to change. The experience itself became more accommodating. What began as an attempt to observe Wyrdspace became an effort to navigate it. What began as a way to detect shadows became a way to interact with them. And what began as passive study became active participation. Which is, of course, why we made a game out of it. And there are places, or perhaps it is more accurate to say, conditions where the usual assumptions about reality begin to loosen their grip. Not all at once, and not dramatically, but gently, almost politely, as though the world itself were stepping back just a little to see what you might do without it. And Wyrdspace, in its earliest encounters, was precisely that kind of condition, a drifting expanse of color and shadow where direction did not quite agree with itself, where movement did not guarantee arrival, and where even the simple idea of standing required a certain quiet optimism. And you did not walk through it in any conventional sense, not really. You experienced something closer to the suggestion of walking, a kind of negotiated motion between intention and perception, and for most that suggestion simply did not hold.
And this instability presented a fundamental limitation to our newly invented neuroforms, the stabilizing programs, because without consistent orientation, no repeatable interaction could be established. Without repeatable interaction, no integration process could occur, which meant that the stabilizing structures we discussed remained theoretically valid, but practically inaccessible.
Yes, one might say we had designed a solution and misplaced the world in which it could function, a minor inconvenience, and yet, as is so often the case, progress did not arrive through refinement of the system, but through the behavior of a single individual who quite inconveniently refused to drift.
The individual later classified as a mystic,
A lovely term suggesting insight and intention, perhaps even a touch of destiny, though I suspect at the time it felt rather less poetic. Because while others entered the Wyrd and were carried by it, this one did something subtly, profoundly different. He did not attempt to navigate the space, but attempted to relate to it.
He found 5 fixed points, the elemental protectors, each one an unshifting anchor in the wired storm. He joined them not in a line, but in a pattern, a perfect pentagon. From that shape, a surface formed where none had been before.
Surface, that most taken for granted of luxuries, the quiet assurance that one might stand. Except here, of course, it was not given, it was maintained. A delicate agreement between perception and persistence, held in place not by matter, but by attention.
And it did not persist independently. The structure required continuous cognitive engagement. Loss of focus resulted in immediate destabilization.
Which is a wonderfully elegant rule, if you think about it. The ground exists for as long as you are capable of holding it in place. And not merely holding, but aligning, because as was soon discovered, stability required more than intention. It required balance.
From these developments, wired journeys were formalized. Billy the Mystic demonstrated that navigation within Wyrdspace was not only possible, but repeatable. He showed others how to stabilize their path and how to complete what is now termed cognifuse, a process in which a neuroform and a shadow are brought into alignment, resulting in an integrated archetypal pattern.
And now, thanks in part to our rather persistent involvement in making WordKeeper neuroforms available through certified local mystic shops, access to Wyrdspace is no longer particularly exclusive. WordKeeper is available in mystic shops everywhere, from imperial courts to the dust-laden markets of Medan, one even behind the neural salon, where the emperor's daughter makes a rather theatrical effort not to be observed. Others hide in back streets, marked only by a faint glyph above the door. But whether you step through velvet curtains or a creaking tin gate, each can take you to the same place. Boom. Wyrdspace. The only question is, will you make it back with all your bits in the right places? This transmission is loosely supported by WyrdKeeper, a game of cognitive mischief. Are you ready? There is a rather comforting assumption most people carry with them. It goes something like this: my thoughts are mine. My mind is my own, and whatever curious nonsense occurs within it remains at the very least a private affair. A reassuring little arrangement. One might even call it a privacy policy.
And in most observable conditions, that assumption holds sufficiently well to be considered functional. Individual cognition is typically bounded by the neural structure of a single organism. Information does not spontaneously transfer between minds.
Yes, a very respectable system. Neat, contained, comfortingly isolated. One signs the terms and conditions of existence and carries on.
There are no such terms.
But that's precisely the problem, Doctor. People behave as though there are.
That behavior is based on consistent empirical observation.
I would say it no longer is.
Please, do clarify.
Well, if a system exists in which thoughts begin to overlap, if experiences are no longer entirely contained, If patterns migrate, blend, and occasionally borrow one another without so much as a polite introduction, then one must ask a slightly uncomfortable question. Who exactly is thinking here?
The answer remains the same. Each cognitive process originates within an individual neural framework. Overlap does not imply shared identity.
No, but it does make ownership rather fuzzy.
Fuzzy is not a scientific term.
And yet remarkably descriptive. Let us imagine, for a moment, a perfectly ordinary thought, something simple, a fear perhaps, or a memory, or one of those delightful half-formed ideas that arrive uninvited and refuse to explain themselves. Now imagine it appears not only to you, but to someone else.
That would indicate pattern duplication.
Doctor, if I may, if the contents can move, if the boundaries can blur, if what you experience can, under certain conditions, originate elsewhere, then your private domain begins to look less like a sealed room and more like a shared hallway with smooth lighting.
This is an exaggeration.
A helpful exaggeration, because the question is not whether minds merge completely. They do not. That would be terribly inconvenient. The question is far more subtle. How much of what you call you is actually negotiated in the presence of others?
There is some evidence that cognition is influenced by external input. Social, environmental, contextual factors.
Oh, much more than influenced, shaped, refined, stabilized, curiosity-mongerers, wanderers of thought. You have already experienced this, a conversation that changes how you think, an idea that feels like yours until you remember where you heard it, a mood that arrives without explanation and leaves just as quietly.
These are standard cognitive phenomena.
Yes, in isolation. Now place them in a shared substrate and remove the neat little walls. Allow patterns to persist beyond the mind that produced them, and suddenly privacy becomes a rather optimistic assumption.
There is still a distinction between influence and identity. You are not dissolving into a collective.
No, but you are less alone than you think.
Which introduces a complication.
Oh, probably several.
If cognition contributes to the structure of the shared environment, and that environment, in turn, influences cognition, then the boundary between observer and system becomes unstable.
There it is.
This is not humorous.
No, but it is interesting because it leads us to a rather elegant conclusion. You are not merely observing Wyrdspace, you are participating in it, not entirely, not completely, but enough that your presence has consequences. And if that is the case, then consciousness may be considerably less private than it has been advertised to be. And so, having wandered this far together, you may begin to notice something rather curious, not within Wyrdspace itself, but within your own experience of it. Because what began as an observation, something distant, something described, has a way of becoming participatory. Not all at once, not in any dramatic fashion, but quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a thought that did not quite announce its arrival, and yet is now undeniably present.
And from a structural perspective, this is not unexpected. Any system in which cognition contributes to stability will, by definition, include the observer within its operational framework.
Yes, which is a wonderfully elegant way of saying you are not entirely outside of what you are perceiving.
Maintained through interaction.
Sustained through attention.
Stabilized through coherent cognitive input.
Or if one prefers a slightly less clinical phrasing, it remains real for as long as someone is willing to treat it as such. And here is the part that tends to go unnoticed, at least at first. This is not unique to Wyrdspace. You do this constantly. In quieter ways, in smaller structures, in the ordinary fabric of what you call reality. A conversation holds because both participants remain within it. A meaning persists because it is shared, reinforced, maintained. A world feels stable not because it cannot change, but because, for the most part, no one is currently asking it to.
Perceived stability is often the result of continuous reinforcement, rather than inherent permanence.
Exactly. So when you step into something like Wyrdspace, where that reinforcement becomes visible, where the seams are no longer hidden, it can feel unusual, unstable, even artificial, and yet it may simply be more honest.
Please clarify.
Well, in a place where thoughts shape structure, where attention sustains continuity, and where coherence must be actively maintained, the relationship between mind and reality is no longer concealed behind habit. It is exposed, which leads us rather naturally to the only conclusion that matters. You are not merely observing the system. You are part of what allows it to remain what it is. And perhaps, just perhaps, once you have noticed it in one place, you may begin to notice it elsewhere. The quiet agreement, the shared continuity, the fragile, persistent act of holding something together and calling it real.
And as with all observed systems, continued interaction will produce further variation.
Which is a polite way of saying there is still quite a lot to explore. If you have followed this far, dreamwalkers, curiosity mongers, wanderers of thought, then you are already doing the only thing that has ever made any of this possible. You are paying attention. And that, as it turns out, is where everything begins.
And where it continues. Submit your impressions for analysis. We will meet again in the next transmission.
Until next time. None of it is real unless you make it real.